The Captain and the Truth at Altitude. At 36,000 feet with 190 souls behind me, an engine tore itself apart on a plane the airline knew it should never have let fly. And when I brought that crippled jet down without losing a single life, the most powerful man in the company thanked me by preparing to end my career for causing the very failure he had concealed. He came for my license, my name, and the truth of the one thing I'd done right. If you've ever done everything right and watched a powerful man rewrite it into your crime, stay with me, because the way this ended is the reason 190 people got home and I got to tell you about it. And before we start, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because the truth about what happened up there only survives if enough people down here refuse to let it be buried and stay to the end. Because the woman who cleared my name was the last person that powerful man ever thought could touch him. My name is Everett Boyd, and I flew for the airlines for 26 years, the last 14 of them in the left seat as captain. There is no job on earth quite like it. You sit at the front of a machine holding hundreds of lives, and everything you do is invisible when it works and unforgivable when it doesn't. And the entire discipline of it, the whole soul of the profession, is that you never ever let anyone rush you into signing off on something that isn't right. Because the bill for that always comes due at altitude, where there is no pulling over. My father was a mechanic in the Air Force, a black man who kept other men's planes flying in a service that made him prove himself twice over for every stripe. And he raised me on one commandment: you don't fly it if it isn't right, and you don't let anybody make you. He told me a story once when I was a boy that I didn't understand until I was a captain. A pilot had once pressured him to sign off on an aircraft my father knew wasn't ready, a hard, impatient man in a hurry who outranked him and made it clear that a mechanic who held up a mission would regret it. And my father had refused. Stood there a young black enlisted man and told a superior officer the airplane doesn't fly today. It cost him. There was a reprimand, a black mark, weeks of being frozen out. And then 2 weeks later, that same type of aircraft went down elsewhere from the exact fault my father had refused to sign off on, and men died, and the ones who'd pressured him went very quiet. I could have signed at Everett, he told me. Would have been easier, and I'd have spent my whole life not knowing if the next one that fell was the one I signed. You can carry a reprimand. You can't carry that. That story is the reason I'm the man I am, and it's the reason decades later at 36,000 feet, and then in a room with Warren Kite, I did what I did. The sky doesn't care about the schedule, he told me. The sky only cares whether the airplane is sound. That sentence is the engine of everything I'm about to tell you. I came up the hard road into aviation, which for a black kid from a working family is the only road there is. Flying is expensive, and the industry was not built to let people like me in. I paid for my ratings with military service and second jobs and a stubbornness I inherited from my father, and I spent decades, as often as not the only black captain on the property, being watched a little closer. My mistakes remembered a little longer. My judgment questioned a little more. It made me meticulous, that scrutiny, the way it makes all of us meticulous. I ran the most disciplined cockpit in the fleet because I had never once been allowed the margin for error that other men took for granted. I raised a child through those years mostly alone after his mother passed. My son's grown, now an air traffic controller still working the sky from the ground, and being the parent who stayed taught me the patience and the calm that one afternoon at 36,000 feet would save 190 lives. The airline I flew for was run by a man named Warren Kite. Warren Kite was the chief operating officer and soon to be CEO of the airline. A finance man, not an aviation man, the kind of executive who had risen by cutting costs and hitting numbers, and had come to believe that an airline was a spreadsheet that happened to have wings. He was polished, decisive, adored by the board for the margins he delivered. And the margins he delivered came from somewhere, and where they came from, I'd begun to understand was maintenance. Warren Kite had quietly built a culture that pushed the fleet harder and maintained it less, deferred repairs, stretched to the legal limit, and passed the wise one. Mechanics pressured to sign off and return aircraft to service inspections, rushed, known problems monitored instead of fixed, all of it dressed in paperwork that kept it just this side of legal, while everyone who actually turned the wrenches knew the truth. He was trading safety margin for money a little at a time, betting the way men like him always bet, that the disaster would happen on someone else's watch or wouldn't happen at all. And I want to be precise about why that kind of man is so dangerous, more dangerous than an obvious crook, because Warren Kite would have been genuinely offended to be called one. In his own mind, he wasn't gambling with lives. He was optimizing. He was managing risk, improving efficiency, eliminating waste, a whole vocabulary designed so that a man could defer a repair on an engine that would later come apart at altitude and never once have to think the words, "I'm willing to let people die to hit my numbers." The distance between his spreadsheet and the cabin was just far enough that he never had to feel it. That's the thing about how disasters are really built. Not by monsters cackling over blueprints, but by reasonable men in good suits. Each shaving a little margin, each signing a little deferral, each trusting that the accumulated risk would land on somebody else. Warren Kite never pictured my cabin. He never pictured a mother gripping an armrest at 6 miles. He pictured a column of numbers going the right direction. And that failure of imagination dressed up as good business is what nearly killed 190 people I was responsible for. It happened on my watch. The aircraft I was assigned that day had a history. I didn't know all of it. Then I know all of it now, but I knew enough to be uneasy. There had been write-ups on one of its engines, a vibration, a pattern of small anomalies that had been deferred and deferred again, signed back into service each time under pressure, the problem within limits. The fix always postponed to keep the airplane earning. I noted my concerns before the flight. I was told, as pilots in that culture were always told, that the aircraft was airworthy, the paperwork was in order, and the schedule was tight. My father's voice was in my head. You don't fly it if it isn't right. But the paperwork said it was right, and a captain can refuse an aircraft. But a black captain who refuses aircraft on a hunch in a company built by Warren Kite learns fast what that costs. I made the call that the records gave me no legal grounds to refuse, and I flew, and I have made my peace with that, because the failure that followed was not mine. It was built into that airplane by men who knew better, on the orders of a man who cared more about the margin than the metal. At 36,000 feet an hour into the flight, the engine that had been written up and deferred and rushed back into service came apart. An uncontained failure. The worst kind, the kind where the engine doesn't just quit but destroys itself and throws debris, damaging systems it was never supposed to touch. In an instant, I had a violently vibrating aircraft warnings screaming across the panel, hydraulics degrading a cabin full of terrified people, and the specific total silence in my own chest that 26 years, and my father's calm, had built for exactly this moment. And I flew the airplane. That's the whole job in the end, distilled to its core when everything is coming apart. You fly the airplane. Let me try to put you in those 4 minutes, because everything that came after turns on them. The failure hit like a bomb going off behind me, a bang that shuttered the whole airframe, and then the airplane trying to roll and yaw as thrust vanished on one side and something tore through systems it was never meant to touch. The cockpit lit up with more warnings than a person can read, a chorus of alarms, all screaming at once, and the airplane fighting me, and behind the door, 190 people who'd just felt their aircraft nearly come apart at 6 miles up. And here's the thing my father built into me, the thing 26 years built into me in that moment. I got quiet. Not calm, exactly quiet. The panic that wants to flood you gets set aside, put in a box to open later, and what's left is just the work. Fly the airplane, pitch and power, keep the wings level. Silence the alarms. You can't act on work, the ones you can. Talk to your first officer, talk to the ground, do the next right thing and then the next one. You do not get to be afraid at 36,000 feet with a crippled jet. You get to be afraid on the ground later alone when everyone's home. I've had the fear since. That afternoon there was only the work, and the work is what brought them down alive. I ran the failure, managed what systems I had left worked, the problem with my first officer talked to the ground, and I brought that crippled jet down onto a runway it had no business reaching, hard but whole, with 190 people who got to go home to their families that night because of decisions I made in the worst 4 minutes of my life. I should have been a hero. For about a day I was. And then Warren Kite understood what an honest investigation of that engine failure would reveal, that the airline had known about the defect, had deferred the repair, had rushed a bad engine back into service to protect the schedule and the margin, and he understood that a hero captain was a liability because a hero captain gets believed, and a believed captain telling the truth about that engine would burn his whole scheme to the ground. So Warren Kite decided that the failure had not been the airlines. It had been mine. The narrative began within days in the way these things begin. Quiet suggestions that Captain Boyd had mishandled the emergency, that the outcome had been luck rather than skill, that there were questions about his decision-making. Then, something uglier. The implication that the engine failure itself had been caused or worsened by something I'd done, an improper procedure, a pilot error, a mishandling of the very emergency I had survived. The airline's internal investigation, run by people who answered to Warren Kite, began quietly building a case that the near disaster was the fault of the man in the left seat, and I understood watching it take shape exactly what was happening. The truth was that a defective engine the airline had knowingly flown had failed, and I had heroically saved everyone. Warren Kite needed the truth to be that a bad pilot had caused an incident with an airplane that was, of course, perfectly maintained. I was going to take the best thing I had ever done and rewrite it into the worst, to bury the fact that his cost-cutting had nearly killed 200 people. They asked me to sign off on their version, a report that softened the airline's maintenance history and emphasized crew performance factors. My signature, the captain's signature, would have closed the loop, made it credible, put the aviator's own name on the lie, and I would not do it. I sat across from Warren Kite's people, and eventually from Warren Kite himself. Calm, reasonable, a model of executive concern. And he explained to me in that polished way that these things were always complex, that no one was blaming me exactly, that a wise captain, nearing the end of a long career, would want to cooperate with the company, protect his pension, protect his legacy, and not turn a survivable incident into a war. He couldn't win against an airline that had a great many lawyers and a great deal of influence with the regulators. He said the word legacy like a man holding it hostage. I told him no. I told him that the engine had been defective, that the airline had known that I had the records to start proving it, and that I would not sign my name to a report that blamed a pilot to hide a fraud. And Warren Kite's polish didn't crack. That's how I knew I was in real trouble. He simply nodded. Told me he was disappointed but understood, and that he hoped I'd reconsider before things became difficult. And I walked out knowing I had made an enemy of the most powerful man in the company over a truth he was certain he could bury under his own paperwork, with the lives of everyone on my next flight riding on whether men like him were ever stopped. The machine came for me the way these machines come through procedure, wearing the face of safety. I was pulled from flying pending review. My handling of the emergency was referred to the FAA, with the airline's framing attached, a framing designed to put my license itself at risk. The whisper campaign spread through the pilot corps that Boyd had gotten lucky, that Boyd had panicked, that Boyd was difficult, that maybe the old captain had lost a step. 26 years of an unblemished record, and in the space of weeks, Warren Kite was turning the best day of my career into evidence against me, and doing it so cleanly that from the outside it looked like a routine safety review of a pilot who'd had a bad day. My pension, my license, my name, all of it suddenly in the hands of the man whose negligence I had survived. I sat in my house near the water that summer, pulled from the sky for the first time in 26 years, watching a powerful man turn my finest hour into my downfall. And I felt the specific helplessness of the man who did everything right and is going to be destroyed for it anyway. Because that was the cruelty of it. I had saved every soul on that airplane, and I was going to lose everything for it, and worse. The truth about that engine was going to stay buried, which meant the next defective airplane Warren Kite flew to protect his margin was going to go up with someone's family aboard, and maybe not find a captain lucky enough to bring it down. And I want to be honest about the particular cruelty of being blamed for the thing you're proudest of, because it's a specific poison. I had spent 26 years preparing for 4 minutes I hoped would never come. And when they came, I met them exactly the way I'd trained to, and 190 people lived. That should have been the proudest achievement of a life. Instead, Warren Kite reached in and turned it into the thing I'd have to defend. The thing whispered about the possible black mark on my record, and in doing so, he stole not just my present but my past, because he made me doubt the one moment I should have been able to hold on to forever. There were nights that summer I actually replayed those 4 minutes, wondering if I'd missed something, if maybe the doubt they were manufacturing had a grain of truth, if a better pilot would have, and then I'd stop, because that's exactly what he wanted, for me to prosecute myself so he wouldn't have to. That's the deepest damage the powerful do. They don't just take your future, they poison your memory of the best thing you ever did so that even your pride becomes a wound. It took Kate Hendricks knocking on my door and the cold, honest voice of the flight data recorder to give me back the truth of my own finest hour. For a while that summer, I believed he'd win because the paperwork was his and the regulators listened to him. And I was one grounded pilot with a hunch and a partial stack of records. The woman who wouldn't let him win had signed one of those maintenance records under protest, and she had been carrying the guilt of it since the day my engine came apart. Her name was Kate Hendricks. She was an aircraft maintenance technician, one of the mechanics who actually kept the fleet flying, an aviation maintenance inspector with 2 decades on the floor. The kind of person who knew the real condition of those airplanes in a way no executive ever would. She was in her late 40s, blunt and grease-stained and fiercely proud of her work. A white woman from a family of Florida shrimpers who'd found her calling with a wrench in her hand and had spent 20 years being talked over by men in suits who couldn't tell a turbine from a toaster. She had been one of the mechanics pressured to sign that engine back into service. She had flagged it, had written up. The vibration had recommended the deeper inspection had been overruled and told to return the aircraft to service on the schedule. And she had done what the pressure demanded and signed and hated herself for it, the way a good mechanic hates herself for the one time she let the schedule win. Not knowing that day that the airplane she was signing back into the sky would nearly fall out of it with 190 people aboard, and that the captain who'd bring it down would end up at her door. And when that engine came apart at 36,000 feet with 190 people aboard, Kate Hendricks had known before the news even reported which aircraft it was, exactly which airplane it had been. She came to my house because she could not live with it. She stood at my door, this tough, grease-stained woman, and she said, "You're the captain that brought down the ship out of Miami. I'm one of the mechanics that signed it out. I flagged that engine, captain. I flagged it and they made me sign it back anyway, and it nearly killed everybody on your airplane, and now I hear they're trying to hang the whole thing on you. I've been sick about it for weeks. So I'm going to ask you straight because I need to hear it from the man who was up there. Did that engine fail on its own, or did you do something wrong?" And I told her the truth, that the engine had come apart on its own exactly as its write-up history predicted, and that I had flown the airplane the best I knew how, and that Warren Kite was rewriting it into pilot error to bury the fact that the airline had knowingly flown a defective engine. And Kate Hendricks listened, and her jaw set, and she said the thing that pulled me up out of that summer. "Then he's about to blame you for a defect I documented and got overruled on. I've got my write-up, captain. I've got the inspection I recommended and the order that overruled it, and I know where the rest of the paper is, the deferrals, the pressure, the whole rotten history of that airframe. You've been trying to fight this with a captain's word against an airline. But I'm the mechanic who signed it under protest, and I kept the receipts, because 20 years on that floor taught me to keep the receipts. You flew the airplane. I know why it broke. Between the two of us, Warren Kite doesn't have a story that survives an honest look. Here is what we built the grounded captain and the maintenance inspector out of nothing but the truth, and a stack of records they were sure no one would ever pull." Kate was right that the maintenance history was the key, because a captain's account of an emergency can be spun, but a paper trail of a knowingly deferred defect cannot. She had her original write-up dated recommending the inspection that was overruled. She knew the aircraft's full deferral history, the pattern of that engine's anomalies, being pushed down the road again and again to keep it earning. And I had my own contemporaneous notes, my pre-flight concerns, the flight data and voice recordings that would show minute by minute that I had run the emergency by the book, and that the failure had originated in the engine, not in the cockpit. Her maintenance truth and my flight truth fit together like two halves of the same broken part. She knew why it broke. I knew what happened when it did. Together we had the whole thing. Warren Kite fought back the instant he sensed us moving, and the fighting showed his full measure. When he learned a mechanic was helping me, the pressure came for Kate. Her competence suddenly questioned a disciplinary review, manufactured hints that a woman with 20 years on the floor might find herself off at the same play he'd run on me. She kept her head up and never flinched. When the FAA framing started to wobble, the airline's lawyers threatened everyone, and pressure came down through channels to keep the internal report on its rails. And there was a moment when key maintenance records went missing in a systems migration, an attempt to erase the very deferrals that would prove the airline's knowledge. But Kate Hendricks, who had spent 20 years being overruled and had learned exactly how the paper disappears, had copies because she had assumed correctly that the day would come when they'd try to make the truth vanish, and she had made sure it couldn't. That was the night I nearly gave up, certain he'd bury it all under his lawyers. And that was the night Kate said the thing that carried me the rest of the way. "They're erasing records, Captain. You don't erase records if the records help you. Every file they burn is proof they know exactly what those files say. He's not defending a good airplane anymore. He's covering up a bad one and covering up that he covered it up. And that's the crime that takes a man like him down. We don't stop. 200 people almost died to save Warren Kite a repair bill. I'm not letting that get filed under pilot error." The break came as it always does from inside, from the people. The powerful or certain will stay silent. The culture Warren Kite had built required the silence of the mechanics, the inspectors, the people who signed off under pressure and hated themselves for it. And that silence had been holding for years, only because everyone believed they were alone in it. When Kate and I quietly reached a federal investigator, an NTSB and FAA inquiry into the engine, failure was already underway and a rigorous investigator named Dana Okafor was pulling threads. The airline hoped she wouldn't. The thread we handed her unraveled the whole garment. And once the investigators had Kate's documented write-up and the deferral history, other mechanics found their courage. A maintenance supervisor sick of being the one who signed the risky sign-offs, an inspector who'd been overruled on other aircraft, a records clerk who could show how the deferrals had been managed. Every corner Warren Kite had cut had a person who'd been forced to cut it, and people, once they see they're not alone, stop being afraid all at once. We took it. Kate's records, the deferral history, my flight data, the other mechanics' testimony to the federal investigation, and carefully to a dogged aviation reporter named Priya Sharma, all at once, so that Warren Kite's lawyers couldn't strangle it quietly. And once the investigators had the maintenance truth, the whole thing came apart in the light. It did not just clear me, it detonated. The federal investigation concluded what Kate and I had known. The engine failure had been caused by a defect the airline documented and knowingly deferred, that maintenance had been systematically pressured to return unsafe aircraft to service to protect the schedule and the margins, and that the Captain Me had not caused the failure, but had in fact saved 190 lives through textbook airmanship in a crippled aircraft. The attempt to blame me collapsed, and worse for Warren Kite. The investigation into how that engine came to fly exposed the entire cost-cutting culture he had built. And Warren Kite, the golden COO, about to be CEO, was charged falsification of federal safety records, fraud, obstruction. And given that his scheme had knowingly put hundreds of lives at risk, worse. The margins the board had adored turned out to have been carved out of the safety of every passenger who ever boarded, and the whole rotten structure came down as the light got in. I saw Warren Kite one last time at the trial, and I want to tell you about the moment I got back what he'd tried to take. His lawyers tried to do to me on the stand what he'd done to me in the review, turned the best thing I'd ever done into a question mark. His lawyer asked me with that manufactured doubt whether it wasn't true that the outcome had been fortunate, whether a different pilot might have done better, whether I could really be sure my own actions hadn't contributed to the severity of the event. He wanted the jury to hear that maybe the hero had also been the problem. And I looked at the jury and then at Kate in the gallery and I said, "You want to know if I'm sure? Let me tell you what I'm sure of. I'm sure 190 people ate dinner with their families that night. I'm sure the engine that failed had been written up and flagged for inspection by the mechanic sitting right there, and that your client's people overruled her and sent it back up to save money. I'm sure I flew that airplane by the book with what I had left, because the flight data recorder says so minute by minute, and it doesn't care what color I am or how much your client wants a different story. You keep saying, fortunate. There was nothing fortunate about it. Luck didn't land that airplane. 26 years landed that airplane. My father landed that airplane. What was fortunate was that your client's greed happened to fail on a day it met a crew that wouldn't let it kill anyone. He should be thanking me. Instead, he's trying to convict me for surviving him." The room was silent. And Warren Kite, who had run an airline from a spreadsheet and never once been made to answer to the people whose lives were in it, looked down at the table because the pilot he'd tried to blame had just read the truth off the recorder in a language his lawyers couldn't spin. I testified, and Kate testified about the engine and the other mechanics. testified about the culture, and the flight data recorder testified in its cold, objective voice that could not be intimidated or bought, and together it was not a captain's word against an airline anymore. It was the machine's own account of what happened and the paper trail of the men who'd made it happen, and there is no lawyer alive who can talk a jury out of a black box. Warren Kite was convicted, the man who thought an airline was a spreadsheet with wings, who'd been so certain that his paperwork and his lawyers and a grounded pilot's powerlessness would let him blame a captain for the disaster his own greed had built. Learned that the sky keeps its own accounts, and that the mechanic he'd overruled had kept hers too. The airline was forced into the light, its deferral culture torn out real reporting protections built for the mechanics and pilots who'd been pressured for years to sign off on the unsafe, so that the next Kate Hendricks who flags an engine and the next Everett Boyd who won't sign the lie would have somewhere to stand that wasn't alone. The reckoning went beyond one airplane, and it's the part I'm proudest of. When it came out that Warren Kite had built a whole culture of deferred maintenance and pressured sign-offs, the investigation didn't stop at my engine. It went through the fleet, and it found other deferred defects, other airplanes flying on borrowed margin, and it grounded and fixed them before the next one failed at altitude. I have thought many times about the disasters that did not happen because Kate kept her receipts, the flights that landed uneventfully, the families who never got a phone call, all of them safe and unaware that they'd been in danger, and that a mechanic and a captain who refused to sign a lie were the reason they weren't. You don't get thanked for the disaster you prevent because no one ever knows it was coming. But I know. Kate knows. Somewhere up there right now, airplanes are flying that were quietly fixed because of what we refused to let stay buried full of people who will never know our names. That's the real verdict. Warren Kite counted the money he saved on every deferred repair. He never once counted the people. We counted the people. That was the whole difference start to finish. Now I've told you about the failure and the fight. Let me tell you about Kate, because somewhere between the wreckage and the truth, I found the thing I'd stopped believing was still coming for a man my age. There was a night that turned it, though I was too disciplined a man to name it then. We'd been over the maintenance logs past midnight, and Kate was quiet, and finally she told me why keeping those records had meant enough to risk everything. She'd grown up on the water in a shrimping family, and she'd lost her father and an uncle to a boat that went out with an engine everyone knew was bad, because the season was short and the money was needed and you don't hold up the boat. She'd been a teenager. And she'd decided in her grief that she would spend her life being the person who says the machine isn't ready, no matter who's in a hurry, because she knew exactly what it cost when nobody did. That's why I became a mechanic, she said. Not for the money, Lord knows, because somewhere there's always a boat or an airplane going out bad, because everybody's in a hurry, and I wanted to be the one standing in the way of it. And then Warren Kite's people made me sign that engine anyway, and I stood in the way and got run over, and it nearly killed 200 people, and it broke something in me. And she looked at me across the logs and said, when you refused to sign their lie, Everett, you did the thing my whole life is about. You stood in the way. I couldn't let you get run over for it alone. I didn't say anything foolish. The fight was still on. But that was the night I understood that Kate Hendricks and I had spent our whole lives standing in the way of men in a hurry from the cockpit and from the floor, and that I'd never wanted anyone the way I wanted the one person who'd bled for the same thing my father bled for. We fell in love the slow way, the only way two people who trust their hands and the hard truth of machines can, carefully mechanically checking every connection before we trusted it with weight. For most of that year, I didn't let myself see it. I was a grounded captain fighting for his name, and she was the mechanic whose records could clear it, and you don't examine your own heart while you're reconstructing an engine failure. But somewhere in all those nights, over maintenance logs and flight data, watching Kate Hendricks risk her 20-year career, her livelihood, her standing on that floor to tell the truth about an engine for a captain she'd never flown with, I understood that I had found the rarest thing there is. A person who cared more about the airplane being right than about the schedule or the money or her own safety, who had flagged that engine when it would have been so much easier to just sign it, who had carried the guilt of being overruled like a wound, and who came to a stranger's door because she could not live with a lie being told about the day her worst fear came true. She loved the truth of the machine the way I did, the way my father did, and she'd never once treated me like a man she was rescuing. She treated me like a colleague she was standing beside. She never once let me be grateful, which is how I knew. When I tried after it was over to thank her for saving my license and my name, she looked up from an engine, cowling, and said, "Everett, I didn't save you. The record saved you. I just kept them when I was supposed to shred them. And I didn't do it for you. I did it because I signed that engine back into service under protest. And it nearly killed 200 people, and I was not going to spend the rest of my life letting them pretend that was a pilot's fault instead of the thing I warned them about. That's not a favor to you. That's me refusing to carry their lie. You flew the airplane. I flagged the engine. We both did our jobs. The only people who didn't do theirs are the ones in suits." And I looked at this woman who trusted the hard truth of a machine more than she trusted any powerful man. And I understood that I'd spent my whole life among people who talked about safety, and that I'd finally found the rare one who'd bled for it. The night, the federal report cleared me and grounded Warren Kite instead after the calls and the vindication and my son's voice cracking on the phone from the control tower. Kate and I sat together on my dock over the water, watching the lights of the jets climbing out of Miami into the dark. And I told her the truth. I'd been too disciplined to say for a year that I'd spent 26 years trusting my life to whether the people on the ground did their jobs right, and that I'd finally met the one who did hers no matter what it cost, and that I wanted to spend whatever came next beside her. And Kate Hendricks, who is not a woman given to softness, got something in her eye she'd blame on the salt air, and she said, "Pre-flight checks out, Captain, cleared for departure." And then she kissed me on the dock under the climbing jets, and it was the smoothest air I'd ever flown into. I got a strange gift in the end that I didn't see coming. Some of the passengers from that flight found me after the truth came out. People who'd been in the cabin during those 4 minutes, who'd gone home to their families, and then watched the airline try to blame the man who'd saved them. A few of them wrote to me, and one of them, a woman who'd been flying home to her own aging father, came to the trial and testified about what it had been like in that cabin, about how the crew's calm had kept 200 people from panic about landing alive. To hear it from the other side of the cockpit door, to know that the 4 minutes I'd been made to doubt had been to the people living through them, exactly what I'd hoped they were, gave me back something Warren Kite had nearly stolen for good. I flew for them. I'd forgotten in the fight that they were real, that they'd gone home, that it had mattered. They reminded me. I went back to the sky. You have to once to prove to yourself the man they tried to break is still the man in the left seat, and I flew a few more good years before I retired on my own terms with my record clean and my name my own. Kate still works the floor, respected now in a way the suits can't touch, training young mechanics to keep the receipts and flag the engine and never, ever sign the lie. We married on that dock, the captain and the mechanic, the sky and the ground, and my son flew in to stand beside me. And some nights, we sit out over the water and watch the jets climb into the dark full of people trusting that everyone who touched their airplane did the job right. And I think about my father, the Air Force mechanic, who told me the sky only cares whether the airplane is sound, and I think he'd have looked at Kate and known the way he knew airplanes, that I'd finally found someone who understood that a life like a flight comes down to whether the people you trust with it did their jobs when no one was watching. A powerful man rewrote the best thing I ever did into my crime to bury the defect his greed had built, and he was certain I'd sign, because almost everyone signs. The whole machine of disaster runs on the fact that it's easier to sign than to stand. But my father taught me, you don't fly it if it isn't right, and you don't let anybody make you, and a mechanic taught me that. The truth is safe as long as somebody keeps the receipts. And it turned out that a captain who flew the airplane and a mechanic who flagged the engine were together stronger than all the paperwork and all the lawyers of a man who thought the sky was a spreadsheet. Warren Kite thought he could file the truth under pilot error. He learned that the sky keeps its own accounts at altitude where his money couldn't reach, and that the two people he most needed to stay silent were the two who would never let a lie fly. If this story flew something in you, do me that favor from the start. Subscribe, because the truth about what happened up there only survives if enough people down here refuse to let it be buried. And tell me in the comments, have you ever done everything right and been blamed for it anyway? I read every single one. And thank you for riding all the way to the end with me. If you've been here for all of these stories, you've probably noticed they rhyme a talented man who wouldn't bend a powerful man. Certain he could erase him, and the one person who refused to look away and stood beside him until the truth came out. That's not an accident. That's the truest thing I know about how the world actually turns. The powerful win by making sure you're alone, and they lose the moment you're not. Every one of us who wouldn't sign the lie had someone who wouldn't let us sign it alone. So here's the only thing I'll ask you to carry out of all of them. Be that person for somebody. Be the one who doesn't look away. Stay close. There are always more truths worth telling and always more people worth standing beside.